October 1st, 1966, Polytechnic of Central London. The venue wasn't glamorous, just a college auditorium that doubled as a concert hall for students and the occasional music industry gathering. The walls were painted institutional green, and the stage was barely elevated above the floor. Folding chairs had been arranged in uneven rows, and the air conditioning hadn't worked properly in months. But tonight, the small room buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with the amateur lighting or the makeshift stage that creaked under the weight of amplifiers and drum kits. Word had spread through London's tight-knit music scene that several major artists would be in attendance for what was supposed to be a quiet showcase of new talent. These informal gatherings happened regularly throughout the city, small events where established musicians could discover emerging artists away from the pressure of major venues and industry executives. Sometimes they produced nothing memorable, but occasionally nights like these changed everything. Eric Clapton arrived fashionably late, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who knew he was the most important person in the room. At 21, graffiti across London declared Clapton is God, and tonight he carried himself like he believed every word. He just formed Cream with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, and everyone in British rock was talking about what this supergroup might accomplish. The guitar slung over his shoulder wasn't just an instrument, it was a symbol of mastery that other musicians aspired to reach, but rarely achieved. He wore his signature leather jacket and carried himself with the casual arrogance that came from being acknowledged as the finest guitarist in Britain. When other musicians saw Clapton enter a room, they paid attention. When he played, they studied his techniques. When he spoke about music, they listened carefully and remembered his words. Tonight was no different. Near the makeshift bar, which was really just a folding table with bottles of warm beer and cheap wine, Clapton spotted familiar faces scattered throughout the small crowd. Members of The Who were clustered in one corner, sharing drinks and animated conversation about their upcoming recording sessions. A couple of Beatles associates had claimed a table near the front, notebooks open as they scouted potential talent for their various projects. The audience wasn't just music fans looking for entertainment. It was a gathering of the people who were actively reshaping popular music in 1966 London. The atmosphere was relaxed but competitive in the way that gatherings of creative people often become. Musicians evaluated each other's work, producers calculated commercial potential, and journalists searched for stories that might capture the attention of their editors. Everyone understood that careers could be made or broken in venues exactly like this one. Clapton ordered a drink and settled in to watch the evening's proceedings with the detached assessment of someone who'd already achieved what most of these artists were still struggling to reach. The first few performances were competent but unremarkable. Young British musicians playing blues-influenced rock with varying degrees of skill and authenticity, covering familiar songs with interpretations that rarely strayed far from established templates. A guitarist named David performed credible versions of Robert Johnson standards. A singer named Margaret delivered passionate but technically flawed interpretations of American soul music. A blues harmonica player demonstrated impressive technique but lacked the emotional depth that separated good musicians from great ones. Clapton watched each performance with polite attention, occasionally nodding approval when someone displayed particular skill. But nothing he heard challenged his understanding of what contemporary music could accomplish. His attention drifted between the stage and conversations with other industry figures who approached him throughout the evening. Record executives wanted his opinion on potential signings. Other musicians sought advice about recording techniques or asked about Cream's plans for their debut album. Journalists requested quotes for articles about the state of British rock music. These interactions reinforced Clapton's position at the center of London's music community. He was young, but his opinion carried weight. When he praised a musician, that person's reputation increased. When he expressed skepticism about an artist's potential, others took notice. The responsibility was something he'd grown comfortable with, even though it sometimes felt heavier than he'd expected. Around 10 o'clock, an announcement crackled through the modest PA system, delivered by a promoter whose voice competed with feedback from the poorly adjusted microphones. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a special guest from America, making his London debut, Jimi Hendrix. The name meant nothing to most people in the room. Clapton took another sip of his drink and glanced toward the stage with mild curiosity. American musicians came through London regularly, usually playing traditional blues that British artists had already absorbed and transformed. He didn't expect to hear anything that would challenge his understanding of what electric guitar could accomplish. Blues was blues, and he'd studied with masters who'd learned directly from the originators of the music. A young black man walked onto the stage carrying a white Fender Stratocaster that seemed to glow under the harsh stage lights. He was dressed flamboyantly by London standards, colorful, patterned clothing that seemed borrowed from a different cultural context entirely. His shirt was purple, with intricate designs that caught the light as he moved. His pants were tight-fitting and made from fabric that looked expensive despite the casual venue. Most striking was his hair, a massive afro that seemed to defy gravity and caught the stage lights like a halo. Everything about his appearance suggested someone who didn't understand the unwritten rules of British rock presentation. English musicians dressed down, emphasizing their working-class authenticity even when they came from comfortable middle-class backgrounds. This American looked like he was headed to a costume party rather than a serious musical performance. Backstage, behind a curtain that had seen better days, Chaz Chandler watched nervously from the wings. The former Animals bassist had discovered Jimi performing in small clubs in New York's Greenwich Village and convinced him to come to London with promises of opportunities that didn't exist in America. But this was their first major test. Performing for an audience that included many of the musicians Chandler hoped would recognize Jimi's potential and help establish his reputation in British music circles. If tonight went badly, their entire experiment might end before it truly began. Chandler had invested his own money in bringing Jimi to London, and he'd used personal connections to secure this performance opportunity. The pressure was enormous, but he believed in what he'd heard during those late nights in New York clubs where Jimi played for audiences that barely filled half the room. Jimi plugged in his Stratocaster and adjusted the amplifier settings with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what sounds he wanted to create. The guitar's tone, when he tested it with a few casual chords, was significantly louder and more distorted than what British audiences typically heard. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances, some disapproving, others curious about where this unusual approach might lead. The sound was aggressive, almost abrasive compared to the cleaner tones that dominated London's music scene. Most British guitarists prize clarity and precision, even when playing blues-influenced material. This American seemed to embrace distortion and feedback as musical elements, rather than technical problems to be avoided. "Good evening," Jimi said quietly into the microphone, his voice barely audible over the room's ambient noise of conversations and clinking glasses. "I'd like to play a song for you." His speaking voice was soft, almost shy, completely at odds with his flamboyant appearance and the aggressive tone coming from his amplifier. The contrast was striking enough that several people in the audience leaned forward, trying to reconcile the gentle demeanor with the powerful sounds they'd already heard during his brief sound check. He started with "Hey Joe," a song most musicians in the room knew, but played very differently from what they were about to hear. The opening of Jimi's version began with a finger-picking pattern that was delicate despite the guitar's high volume settings. His approach to the familiar melody was both respectful of the original and completely personal, finding spaces in the song that other artists had never explored or perhaps never imagined existed. Clapton stopped his conversation with a journalist and turned his full attention to the stage. Something about Jimi's initial touch on the strings suggested a level of control that was unusual even among accomplished professionals. This wasn't just competent playing. This was someone who understood the guitar at a fundamental level that went beyond technical training or years of practice. The way Jimi held his instrument was different from British guitarists. Where they typically maintained formal posture and careful hand positioning, he seemed to merge with the Stratocaster, making it an extension of his body rather than a tool he was operating. His fingers moved across the fretboard with fluid precision, but there was something intuitive about his approach that suggested he was discovering the music as he played, rather than executing predetermined arrangements. As the song progressed, Jimi began adding elements that no one in the room had ever heard before in live performance. He used feedback not as a mistake to be avoided, but as a musical tool to be shaped and controlled with subtle adjustments to his position relative to the amplifier. The tremolo bar on his Stratocaster created sounds that seemed to defy the instrument's physical limitations, bending notes into territories that other guitarists had never explored. Most striking was the way he played rhythm and lead simultaneously, making one guitar sound like multiple instruments layered together in complex arrangements. His thumb worked the lower strings while his fingers danced across the higher ones, creating complete musical arrangements that most bands required several musicians to achieve. The technique was sophisticated beyond anything the audience had previously witnessed. The crowd gradually fell silent as people realized they were hearing something genuinely revolutionary. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as even the most distracted audience members became aware that something extraordinary was happening on the small stage. This wasn't just another American playing blues. This was someone expanding the vocabulary of electric guitar in real time, creating new possibilities with every note. Musicians in the audience began studying Jimmy's hand positions, trying to understand how he was creating sounds they'd never heard before. The technical aspects were impressive, but more important was the musical intelligence behind every choice. Nothing seemed random or accidental. Every effect, every unusual technique served the emotional content of the song. Then Jimmy did something that changed the room's energy completely and challenged every assumption the audience had made about guitar performance. He lifted the white Stratocaster to his mouth and began playing the melody with his teeth, not as a theatrical flourish or attention-grabbing gimmick, but as a natural extension of his musical expression. The notes that emerged were clean, precise, and somehow more emotionally intense than anything he'd played with conventional finger techniques. The technique wasn't about showing off or demonstrating unusual skills. It was about accessing sounds and textures that conventional playing couldn't reach, finding new ways to make the electric guitar communicate feelings that words couldn't express. The music coming from his teeth was controlled, musical, and profoundly moving in ways that defied logical explanation. Eric Clapton's drink stopped halfway to his lips, forgotten as he stared at the stage with an expression that mixed disbelief with something approaching existential fear. Everything he thought he knew about guitar playing was being redefined by a musician he'd never heard of, playing techniques he'd never imagined, creating sounds that challenged his understanding of what the electric guitar could accomplish. The room had gone completely silent except for Jimmy's guitar, which now sounded like it was singing with a human voice, crying with emotions too complex for simple categorization. Musicians who thought they understood the boundaries of their instruments watched those boundaries dissolve before their eyes. The sound coming from the stage was massive, three-dimensional, unlike anything any of them had heard on recordings or in previous live performances. When Jimmy finished "Hey Joe" and gently set his guitar back into conventional playing position, there was a beat of absolute silence that seemed to last forever. The kind of pause that happens when something profound has just occurred, and nobody wants to be the first to break the spell with inappropriate noise or premature applause. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly the room erupted in applause that was qualitatively different from typical audience response. This wasn't polite appreciation or enthusiastic entertainment. This was the sound of musicians recognizing mastery they hadn't known was possible, acknowledging that they just witnessed something that would change how they thought about their own instruments and their own limitations. Backstage, Chaz Chandler allowed himself a small smile of relief and satisfaction. The enormous risk had paid off beyond his most optimistic expectations. But even he hadn't anticipated the depth of response Jimmy's performance would generate from this particular audience of sophisticated music industry professionals. Clapton remained motionless in his spot near the makeshift bar, his drink growing warm in his forgotten hand. Around him, other musicians were talking excitedly, trying to process what they'd just witnessed, attempting to analyze techniques they couldn't fully comprehend. But Clapton couldn't join those conversations yet. He was still absorbing the implications of what he'd heard, feeling something fundamental shift in his understanding of his own abilities and limitations. The confidence he'd carried into the venue, the easy assurance of being called God by fans across London, had been replaced by something more complex and uncomfortable. Not defeat, exactly, but a recognition that the landscape of guitar playing had just shifted in ways he was only beginning to understand. For the first time in years, Eric Clapton felt like a student again. After the show, as people approached Jimmy with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect, Clapton watched these interactions from a distance. The casual dismissal that often greeted unknown American musicians was nowhere to be found. Instead, established British artists wanted to know where he'd learned to play, what records had influenced him, whether he'd be performing again soon. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin and roadies started breaking down equipment, Clapton found himself near the stage where Jimmy was carefully packing his white Stratocaster into a battered case. For the first time in years, the British guitarist felt uncertain about approaching another musician. The easy superiority he'd grown accustomed to had been replaced by genuine curiosity mixed with vulnerability. "That was extraordinary," Clapton said finally, his voice quieter than usual. Jimmy looked up from his guitar case, genuinely surprised by the attention from someone he recognized as a major figure in London's music scene. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." The conversation was brief, both musicians still processing the evening's events in their own ways. But something had fundamentally changed in British rock's ecosystem that night. The arrival of Jimi Hendrix hadn't just introduced a new player to the scene, it had expanded everyone's understanding of what was possible with six strings and an amplifier. The aftermath of that single song would reshape British rock music in ways that nobody in the room could have predicted that October evening.